There are some truths so heavy that speaking them out loud requires every ounce of strength a person has left. What happened when 90-year-old Walter Cunningham stepped onto the Family Feud stage was one of those moments that nobody could have predicted, nobody could have prepared for, and nobody who witnessed it would ever forget. He shuffled onto the stage slowly, using a cane for support, his hands shaking slightly from age and what might have been nervousness. His family surrounded him, 3 generations all there to support him, all thinking this was just going to be a fun day, a chance to make memories with their patriarch before time ran out. But within 15 minutes, Walter would say something so devastating, so raw, that Steve Harvey would do something he'd never done before in all his years of hosting. He would walk away, not off the stage entirely, but away from Walter, turning his back to the cameras and the audience, his shoulders shaking, unable to face what he'd just heard. If you've ever made a choice that haunted you for the rest of your life, if you've ever wondered whether the sacrifices you made were worth it, you need to hear what this 90-year-old man had been carrying for 7 decades. Before we dive in, if you believe that some truths need to be told no matter how painful they are, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because we share stories about real people facing real consequences of real decisions. Walter Cunningham was born in 1934 in a small farming town in Iowa. He was the eldest of 6 children, born during the Great Depression to parents who worked themselves to the bone just to keep their family from starving. His father farmed a small plot of land that never seemed to yield quite enough, and his mother took in laundry from wealthier families in town, washing and ironing clothes until her hands were raw and cracked. Walter learned early that life was about survival, about doing what needed to be done regardless of what you wanted. There was no room for dreams in a house where every day was a struggle to put food on the table. By the time he was 10 years old, Walter was working alongside his father in the fields, missing school during planting and harvest seasons because the family needed every pair of hands they could get. His teachers would send notes home saying Walter was a bright boy, that he had potential, that with an education he could make something of himself. But his father would read those notes and shake his head. "We need him here," he'd say simply, and that was the end of the discussion. When Walter was 17 in 1951, something happened that would set the course for the rest of his life. His father had a stroke while working in the fields one summer morning. He survived, but he was left partially paralyzed on his left side, unable to do the heavy physical labor that farming required. Walter's mother sat him down that evening, her face lined with exhaustion and worry, and she told him what he already knew in his heart. "You're the man of the house now," she said. "Your brothers and sisters are counting on you. Your father is counting on you. We need you to keep this farm running." Walter had been planning to enlist in the military that fall. It was his way out, his chance to see the world beyond their small Iowa town, his opportunity to build a different life. But looking at his mother's tired eyes thinking about his younger siblings who were only 12, 10, 8, 6, and 4 years old, he knew he couldn't leave. So he stayed. He threw himself into the farm work with a determination born of duty and resignation. He worked 18-hour days, learning everything he could about modern farming techniques, about crop rotation and soil management and equipment maintenance. He was good at it, better than his father had been if he was honest with himself. Within 2 years, the farm was more productive than it had ever been. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they were stable. The family wasn't going hungry anymore. His siblings could stay in school. His father could rest and recover as much as his damaged body would allow. And Walter buried his dreams of a different life deep inside himself, where they couldn't interfere with his responsibilities. Then, in 1954, when Walter was 20 years old, he met Catherine Miller at a church social. She was 18, the daughter of the town doctor, smart and beautiful and full of life. She had plans to go to nursing school, dreams of working in a big city hospital, ambitions that extended far beyond their small town. But she fell in love with Walter, with his quiet strength, his sense of responsibility, his gentle nature that he tried to hide behind a serious demeanor. They courted for 6 months before Walter asked her to marry him. He was honest with her in a way that was almost brutal. "I can't leave this farm," he told her. "I can't leave my family. If you marry me, this is the life you're choosing. A farm in Iowa, hard work, not much money, probably a lot of children because that's how farm families work. You won't get to go to nursing school. You won't get to live in a city. You'll be a farmer's wife, and that's all." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her dreams flickering in her eyes, see her imagining the life she was giving up. But she loved him, and she was young, and she believed that love was enough to make any sacrifice worthwhile. "I choose you," she said. "I choose this life." They were married 3 months later in a simple ceremony at the local church. Catherine wore a borrowed dress and carried wildflowers from the field. They spent their wedding night in the small room Walter had built onto his parents' house, and they began their life together with hope and determination and love that felt strong enough to weather any storm. For the first few years, it was good. Hard, but good. Catherine adapted to farm life with grace and resilience. She learned to cook for large groups, to preserve food for winter, to manage a household budget that was always stretched thin. She helped in the fields during busy seasons, worked alongside Walter from dawn to dusk, never complained about the calluses on her hands or the exhaustion that made her bones ache. They had their first child, a son they named Michael, in 1956. Their second, a daughter named Susan, came in 1958. A third child, another boy named Robert, was born in 1960. Catherine poured her love into her children and into supporting Walter, and if she ever thought about the dreams she'd given up, she never said so out loud. Walter's siblings grew up and eventually left the farm one by one. His youngest brother went to college on a scholarship. His sisters married and moved to different towns. By 1965, it was just Walter, Catherine, their 3 children, and Walter's aging parents on the farm. And that's when Catherine started talking about leaving. Not leaving Walter, but leaving the farm. "Your siblings are gone," she said one night as they sat on their porch after the children were asleep. "Your parents are old, but they're healthy enough. We've done our duty, Walter. We've kept this place running for 15 years. Maybe now we could think about doing something different. Maybe we could move to a city. You could get a job doing something else. I could finally go to nursing school. It's not too late. The children could have better opportunities." Walter listened to her talk about this possible future, and something cold settled in his chest. Because the truth was, he was scared. He was 31 years old and farming was all he knew. The idea of starting over in a city, of finding a different kind of work, of navigating a world he'd never been part of, it terrified him. But more than that, he'd built his entire identity around being the responsible one, the one who stayed, the one who sacrificed. If he left now, what did that make all those years of sacrifice mean? Had he given up his dreams for nothing? So he said no. He told Catherine they couldn't leave, that his parents still needed them, that the farm was their security, that starting over would be too risky with 3 young children. She argued with him, gently at first and then more insistently as the weeks went on. "When Walter," she asked him, "when will it be time for us to live the life we want instead of the life we have to live?" He didn't have a good answer for that, so he just kept saying no, kept insisting they had to stay, kept finding reasons why leaving was impossible. And eventually, Catherine stopped asking. But something changed between them. The light in her eyes dimmed a little. Her smiles became less frequent. She still worked hard, still took care of their children and the household, still supported Walter in all the ways a wife was expected to. But there was a distance now, a sadness that Walter could see, but didn't know how to address. So he ignored it, threw himself even deeper into the farm work, told himself that she'd come around eventually, that she'd understand that stability was more important than dreams. In 1972, when Catherine was only 36 years old, she found a lump in her breast. By the time she finally told Walter about it, by the time they finally went to a doctor, it was advanced stage for breast cancer, the doctor said. If they caught it earlier, if she'd been getting regular checkups, maybe things would be different. But rural Iowa in the early 1970s wasn't a place where people went to the doctor unless something was seriously wrong. And by the time Catherine admitted something was seriously wrong, it was too late. She lived for 18 more months, growing weaker and thinner, the cancer spreading through her body like wildfire. And during those 18 months, she said something to Walter that would echo in his mind for the next 5 decades. It was 3 months before she died, in the middle of the night, when the pain was bad enough that she couldn't sleep. Walter was sitting beside her bed, and she took his hand with her skeletal fingers. "I'm not angry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I want you to know that. I'm not angry that we stayed. I know you were scared. I know you were doing what you thought was right. But Walter, I wish we'd gone. I wish we'd been brave enough to try. I wish our children could have seen me be something other than a farmer's wife who never got to chase her dreams." Walter tried to tell her she was so much more than that she'd been an amazing mother and wife, that their life together had meant something. But Catherine shook her head weakly. "Our children will stay here now," she said. "They'll think this is all there is. They'll be afraid to leave just like you were. And they'll give up their dreams too, and maybe their children will do the same, and it will go on and on. All because we were too scared to try something different." She died 2 weeks later, at home in their bed, with Walter holding her hand. She was 37 years old. Walter was 39. And he knew, even then, that she'd been right about everything. Their son Michael did stay on the farm. He never went to college, never left Iowa, married a local girl, and had his own children, and worked the same land his father had worked. Susan left for a while, went to community college in a nearby town, but she came back within 2 years and married a local man, and settled into the same kind of life her mother had lived. Only Robert, the youngest, managed to break free, moving to Chicago for college and staying there, building a different kind of life. But even Robert carried the weight of family obligation, sending money home regularly, visiting as often as he could, always feeling guilty that he'd left. Walter ran the farm for another 30 years, into his 70s, before finally selling it and moving into a small house in town. He'd spent 50 years on that land, 50 years doing his duty, 50 years living the life he'd chosen out of fear disguised as responsibility. His children grew up and had children of their own, and Walter watched as they repeated many of the same patterns, staying close to home, playing it safe, not reaching for anything beyond what they already had. And every day, every single day for 52 years, Walter thought about Catherine's words. He thought about how she'd given up her dreams for him, how she died without ever getting to become the person she'd wanted to be, how her last words to him had been about regret. He tried to be a good father, a good grandfather, a good man, but he carried the knowledge that his fear, his inability to be brave enough to try something different, had cost Catherine her dreams and maybe her life. Because if they'd moved to a city, maybe she would have gotten better medical care sooner, maybe she would have lived. Nah, at 90 years old, Walter had outlived his wife by 52 years. His children were in their 60s. His grandchildren were adults with their own families. And he'd been invited to be on Family Feud by his great-granddaughter, Emily, who was 23 and who seemed to have inherited some of Catherine's spirit, her desire for more, her willingness to chase dreams. Emily was about to move to New York to pursue a career in fashion design, and she wanted to do this show as a last family adventure before she left. The whole family was there: Michael and his wife, Susan and her husband, Robert, who had flown in from Chicago, several grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They were all excited, treating it like a celebration, like a fun day together. None of them knew what Walter was planning to say. None of them knew that he'd decided, at 90 years old with death approaching, that he needed to finally tell the truth about the biggest regret of his life. Steve Harvey greeted the Cunningham family with his usual warmth and energy. He worked his way down the line, getting names and relationships, making jokes, building rapport. When he got to Walter, he said, "And you must be the patriarch of this beautiful family. 90 years old. Sir, what's the secret? How do you make it to 90? Walter looked at Steve with eyes that held decades of sorrow. "You make it to 90 by staying safe," he said. "By never taking risks. By choosing security over everything else. You make it to 90 by surviving, not living." The smile on Steve's face faltered slightly. There was something in Walter's tone, something heavy, that made the atmosphere shift. "That's an interesting answer," Steve said carefully. "Sounds like there's a story there." Walter nodded. "There is. There's a story I've been holding on to for 52 years. And I think I need to tell it now, before I run out of time." Steve looked at the producers, uncertain, but something in Walter's expression made him stay put. "All right, Mr. Cunningham. If you need to say something, we're listening." Walter looked at his family, at their confused and concerned faces. He looked at Emily, his great-granddaughter, who was about to chase her dreams in a way his wife had never gotten to. And he started talking. "In 1954, I married the love of my life. Her name was Catherine. She was smart, ambitious, full of dreams. She wanted to be a nurse, wanted to work in a city, wanted to see the world. But she loved me, and I was tied to a farm in Iowa, taking care of my family. So she gave up her dreams to marry me." His voice was steady but quiet, and the studio had gone completely silent. "For 11 years, she lived on that farm with me. We had 3 children. She worked hard, never complained. But in 1965, she asked me if we could leave. My parents were stable, my siblings were gone. She asked if maybe we could finally do something different, if she could finally go to nursing school, if we could give our children a different kind of life." Walter paused, and tears started rolling down his weathered cheeks. "And I said no. I was scared. Farming was all I knew. The idea of starting over terrified me. So I said no, and I kept saying no, and eventually she stopped asking. She just accepted that her dreams were dead." Steve Harvey was completely still, his full attention on Walter. 7 years later, in 1972, she was diagnosed with cancer, advanced cancer. And before she died, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said our life together had been built on fear instead of courage, and that our children would inherit that fear, and their children after them. She said she wished we'd been brave enough to try. Walter's voice broke. She died when she was 37 years old. 37. She never got to be a nurse. She never got to see a city. She never got to become the person she was supposed to be. And it was my fault. Not the cancer, that wasn't my fault, but her unfulfilled life, that was absolutely my fault. His son Michael stepped forward. Dad, you don't have to do this. But Walter shook his head. Yes, I do. Because Emily is about to leave for New York, and I see so much of your grandmother in her. That same spark, that same courage to chase dreams. And I need to tell all of you what I should have told you decades ago. I was wrong. I was wrong to stay on that farm when we could have left. I was wrong to let fear dictate our lives. I was wrong to make your mother give up everything she wanted. And because of my choices, you all learned to play it safe, to not reach for more, to accept limitation instead of possibility. He turned to look directly at Steve Harvey. I've lived to be 90 years old. Do you want to know what that's worth? Nothing. It's worth nothing if you spend all those years with regret, knowing you let the person you loved most in the world die without ever becoming who she was meant to be. I have 90 years of survival, but my wife only got 37 years of life she didn't want. That's not a fair trade. That's not something to celebrate. The impact of Walter's words hit the room like a physical force. Steve Harvey stood there, and his expression went through a transformation. Shock, sadness, recognition, pain, all of it crossing his face in waves. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He tried again, but still no words. And then, for the first time in his entire career on Family Feud, Steve Harvey turned around and walked away from a contestant. Not off the stage completely, but he walked several steps away, his back to the cameras, his hand over his face. His shoulders were shaking. The audience sat in stunned silence. The producers didn't know what to do, and Walter just stood there, tears streaming down his face, watching Steve process what he'd just heard. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, Steve turned back around. His eyes were red, his face was wet with tears, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Mr. Cunningham, he started, then stopped, gathering himself. Mr. Cunningham, I need to walk away from this for a minute because what you just said hit me so hard I can't think straight. I need everyone to understand why. He addressed the audience and cameras. This man just articulated the fear that I think most of us carry. The fear of taking risks. The fear of chasing dreams. The fear of letting the people we love chase their dreams. And he's lived with the consequences of that fear for 52 years. He walked back toward Walter, and now he was speaking directly to him. But sir, with all due respect, I need to push back on something you said. You said your wife's life was wasted, that she died without becoming who she was meant to be. But did she tell you she wasted her life? Walter looked confused. She said she wished we'd gone. She said she wished she'd gotten to chase her dreams. Steve nodded. She said she wished. That's not the same thing as saying her life was wasted. Did she love your children? Walter's voice was soft. More than anything. Steve continued, did she love you, even after you said no to leaving? Walter nodded, crying harder now. She said she wasn't angry. She said she understood I was scared. Steve's voice grew stronger. Then her life wasn't wasted. It wasn't what she planned. It wasn't what she dreamed of. But it was still full of love and meaning and purpose. She raised 3 children. She supported you. She lived fully even if she didn't live the life she imagined. That matters. He paused, then said something that cut to the core of everything. But here's the real truth, Mr. Cunningham. You're not here today because you regret your wife's unlived dreams. You're here because you regret your own. You're here because you made a choice out of fear, and you've spent 52 years knowing you were capable of more courage than you showed. That's what you can't forgive yourself for. Not that Catherine died with unfulfilled dreams, but that you were too afraid to help her fulfill them. Walter stared at Steve, and something in his face suggested this was the first time anyone had said this to him so directly. You're right, he whispered. I was a coward, and she paid the price for my cowardice. Steve shook his head firmly. No, stop. You weren't a coward. You were scared. There's a difference. You were 31 years old. You'd never left your hometown. You had 3 small children, and aging parents, and a farm that was your only source of income. Leaving would have been a huge risk. Maybe it would have worked out beautifully, or maybe you would have failed and lost everything. You don't know. You'll never know. And beating yourself up for 52 years about a choice you made with the limited information and perspective you had at 31 years old, that's not fair to yourself. Robert, Walter's youngest son who had moved to Chicago, spoke up. Dad, is this why you always told me I should stay close to home? Is this why you seemed disappointed when I left?" Walter looked at his son with devastation in his eyes. "No, I wasn't disappointed. I was proud of you. You did what I couldn't do. You were brave enough to try. I just wished I'd had that courage. I wished I'd been able to give that example to all of you." Emily, the great-granddaughter, stepped forward. "Grandpa Walter, is this about me leaving for New York? Are you trying to tell me not to go?" Walter looked at her, and suddenly his expression changed. The pain was still there, but something else emerged, something fierce and determined. "No, baby. I'm telling you the exact opposite. I'm telling you that you should go. You should chase every dream you have. You should be brave in all the ways I wasn't. And if anyone in this family tries to guilt you into playing it safe, into staying small, you tell them about me. You tell them about your great-grandmother Catherine, who died at 37 with dreams she never got to fulfill. You tell them that life is short and unpredictable, and the only real waste is living it safely instead of fully." Steve Harvey was nodding, tears still streaming down his face. "Now that, Mr. Cunningham, that right there, that's what your granddaughter needed to hear. That's what your whole family needed to hear. That's what everyone watching this needs to hear." He turned to address the cameras again. "We spend so much time playing it safe. We talk ourselves out of taking risks. We let fear make our decisions. And then we wake up one day at 90 years old and realize we survived but we didn't really live. Mr. Cunningham has given us a gift today. He's shown us what regret looks like after 52 years. He's warned us, and we need to listen." Walter spoke again, his voice stronger now. "I need my family to understand something. I loved your mother, your grandmother, with everything I had, but I loved her wrong. I loved her by trying to keep her safe, by trying to keep our life stable and predictable. I didn't love her by helping her become who she wanted to be. And that's my greatest regret. Not that she died young, though that's a tragedy, but that I had 11 years with her, and I spent those years saying no instead of yes." Michael, his oldest son, finally spoke, and his voice was shaking. "Dad, I had no idea you carried this. All these years, you never said anything." Walter looked at his children. "How could I? How could I tell you that the reason I pushed you all to stay close, to play it safe, was because I was scared? What kind of father teaches his children to be afraid?" Susan, his daughter, was crying. "But you taught us to be responsible, to be reliable, to take care of our families. Those are good things." Walter nodded. "They are good things, but they're not the only things. You can be responsible and still chase dreams. You can take care of your family and still take risks. I just didn't know how to do both, so I chose safety every time. And I taught you all to do the same." Steve Harvey stepped back in. "Mr. Cunningham, I need to ask you something. If you could go back, if you could talk to your 31-year-old self in 1965 when Catherine asked to leave, what would you tell him?" Walter thought for a moment, and when he answered, his voice was clear and certain. "I would tell him to be afraid. That's okay. Fear's normal, but don't let fear make the decision. I would tell him that Catherine's dreams matter just as much as his security. I would tell him that his children will learn more from watching him be brave than from watching him be safe. And I would tell him that if he says no, if he chooses to stay, he'll spend the rest of his life wondering what could have been. And that wondering, that regret, it will poison everything." Steve nodded slowly. "That's wisdom right there. That's the kind of wisdom that only comes from living with the consequences of your choices for 52 years. And now you're sharing it with your family, with all of us, so we don't have to make the same mistakes." He turned to Emily. "Young lady, your great-grandfather just gave you an incredible gift. He's giving you permission to go, to chase your dreams, to be brave. Don't waste it." Emily walked over to Walter and hugged him tightly. "I won't, Grandpa. I promise. And I'll make you proud. I'll make great-grandma Catherine proud." The show didn't continue normally after that. The game became secondary to the conversation that was happening. Steve talked with the Cunningham family for another 20 minutes, mostly off camera, but with the audience still present. They talked about fear, about regret, about the lessons we learned too late, about how to break generational patterns. Michael admitted that he'd stayed on the farm partly because he thought it was what his father wanted, and now he was wondering if he'd made the same mistake his father had. Robert talked about the guilt he'd carried for leaving, and how Walter's words were finally releasing him from that guilt. Susan cried as she talked about dreams she'd given up and whether it was too late to pursue them now. The audience participated too, with people sharing their own stories of choices made from fear, of dreams deferred, of regrets they were carrying. It became a collective therapy session, a shared acknowledgement that we're all struggling with these same questions about how to live courageously instead of just safely. When the taping finally ended, something extraordinary happened. Emily, the great-granddaughter who was moving to New York, stood up and made an announcement to her family. I'm naming my first collection after great-grandma Catherine, she said. The Catherine Cunningham collection. Because her dreams didn't die with her. I'm going to carry them forward. I'm going to be brave enough for both of us. Walter sobbed when she said this, but they were different tears, not just tears of regret, but tears of hope, tears of redemption, tears of a burden finally being shared instead of carried alone. The episode aired 8 weeks later, and like the previous viral Family Feud moments, it was viewed millions of times. But the response was different this time. People weren't just moved by the emotion, they were challenged by it. The comments were full of people asking themselves hard questions. Am I living out of fear? What dreams have I given up? Am I teaching my children to play it safe instead of being brave? Is it too late to change course? Therapists reported a surge in clients wanting to talk about regret and unfulfilled dreams. Life coaches saw their practices boom with people wanting help making career changes or pursuing long-deferred goals. The phrase "don't let fear make the decision" became a mantra for people trying to live more courageously. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on families. Parents started having different conversations with their children about dreams and risk and courage. Adult children started asking their aging parents about their regrets and unfulfilled dreams. Families started examining the patterns they'd been repeating across generations, asking whether those patterns were serving them or limiting them. Walter Cunningham became an unlikely spokesman for courageous living at 90 years old. He did interviews, he spoke at events, he shared his story whenever anyone would listen. And his message was always the same: don't wait until you're 90 years old to realize you chose safety over life. Don't wait until it's too late to chase dreams. Don't let fear masquerade as responsibility. Emily moved to New York as planned, and Walter flew out to visit her 6 months later for her first fashion show. The Catherine Cunningham collection was a success, featuring designs inspired by 1950s farm life, but reimagined with modern sophistication and edge. Walter sat in the front row crying as models walked the runway, wearing clothes that honor his late wife's memory and unrealized dreams. The show ended with Emily walking out wearing a simple farm dress, the kind Catherine would have worn, but made from luxury fabrics and cut in a contemporary style. She looked directly at Walter and said into the microphone, "This is for you, great-grandma Catherine. Your dreams didn't die, they just took a different path. And this is for you, Grandpa Walter, for being brave enough to finally tell the truth. It's never too late to inspire courage." The audience gave a standing ovation, and Walter stood too, his old body shaking with emotion, his hands clapping until they hurt, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in 52 years. Steve Harvey stayed in touch with Walter after the show. They talked every few weeks, to men from different generations and different backgrounds, but connected by that moment of raw truth on television. Steve said later that meeting Walter had changed how he thought about his own life and choices. "I realized I've been making some decisions out of fear too," Steve said in an interview. "Playing it safe in certain areas because I was worried about failing or looking foolish. Walter showed me that the cost of playing it safe is living with regret, and that's a price I'm not willing to pay anymore." Walter Cunningham lived for 2 more years after his appearance on Family Feud. He died peacefully at age 92, surrounded by his family. But those last 2 years were different from the previous 52. The burden he'd been carrying was lighter because it was shared. The regret was still there, but it was tempered with purpose, with the knowledge that his story was helping others make different choices, braver choices. At his funeral, Emily stood up to speak. She talked about her great-grandfather's courage in finally telling the truth, in exposing his deepest regrets so that others could learn from it. She talked about how his story had changed her life, given her permission to chase her dreams without guilt, without fear of disappointing her family. And then she said something that brought everyone to tears. Great-grandpa Walter thought he'd wasted his life by playing it safe. But in the end, by finally being brave enough to tell the truth, he saved so many other lives from being wasted the same way. He saved mine. He saved my parents and my grandparents. He saved everyone who heard his story and decided to choose courage over fear. That's not a wasted life. That's a life that mattered. That's a legacy. Michael stood up next and talked about how his father's confession had freed him to make a change he'd been thinking about for years. At 66 years old, he finally sold the farm and was going back to school to study agricultural science, something he'd always been interested in but never pursued. "It's not too late," he said. "That's what my father taught me. It's not too late to change course, to choose bravery, to honor the dreams we've been ignoring." Robert talked about how he'd been carrying guilt for leaving Iowa, and how his father's words had released him from that guilt and helped him understand that his choice to leave had actually been an act of courage, not betrayal. Susan talked about going back to community college at 63 to finish the degree she'd started and abandoned 40 years ago. Each of them, in their own way, was living out the lesson Walter had finally taught them, that fear makes a poor foundation for a life, that it's never too late to choose differently, that courage is always worth it even when it's hard. If this story challenged you the way it challenged all of us, if it made you think about the choices you're making and whether fear is making them instead of you, please hit that like button and share this video with everyone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel because we need more stories like this, stories that force us to examine our lives, stories that inspire us to be braver, stories that remind us that the only real failure is living safely instead of fully. Walter Cunningham waited 52 years to confess his biggest regret, and when he finally did, it changed not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who heard him. His story reminds us that we have a choice every single day between fear and courage, between safety and dreams, between surviving and truly living. And it reminds us that the people we love deserve our courage. They deserve to see us chase dreams and take risks and live fully, because that's what teaches them to do the same. Walter's wife Catherine died at 37 without becoming a nurse. But through Walter's confession and Emily's success and the ripple effects of one man finally telling the truth, Catherine's dreams lived on in a way she never could have imagined. That's the power of courage, even courage that comes decades too late. That's the power of truth, even truth that's painful to speak. And that's the legacy of Walter Cunningham, a man who spent 52 years regretting his fear but who finally, at 90 years old, taught us all how to be brave.